Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. Every country has a right to defend itself, and every person on planet Earth deserves a safe place to live. What happens when these two things collide? What does that intersection look like? And we're seeing that right now with the people of Palestine and the people who live in Gaza. The Gaza Strip it has become under fire since the Hamas decided that they wanted to kidnap Israeli citizens and take them hostage. The Hamas decided that it was a good idea to go and attack innocent civilian people, which triggered a chain effect. You attack Israel and they attack back. They will very convincingly show you that they have a right to defend themselves, that they will defend themselves well. And we see that in Israel and the people, the citizens of Israel, have a right to a safe place to live, the same as the Palestinians do. The Israeli government has launched aerial attacks with shelling, and the environment of itself of the fighting caused a hospital to be destroyed. Recently, that there was enough of a corridor for injured people to escape to Egypt, which the WHO helped get those people to hospitals in Egypt and emergency treatment for their injuries. There is also a UN directive, and it is an internationally recognized law that hospitals and other types of civilian safe havens are to be off limits for attack. So why are we seeing a legitimate government, a UN government, a government that has agreed to these measures? What is their reasoning for attacking civilian sites? What is their reasoning for continued shelling and bombings and on civilian sites in Gaza? And that is what we're going to hear next in this next UN Emergency General Assembly meeting about why is Israel attacking civilian sites, and what is the UN Security Council going to do to put a stop to it. I want to say this, though. More than that, I want to see the UN Security Council come up with a measure that will allow Israel and Palestine to not only stop the fighting, but in the ongoing conflict of colonialism in the area that allows both people some sort of equality, that they know that they can walk down the street and know that it is equally as much their home because they're Israeli as much as it is their home because they're Palestinian. Everyone who is in that region probably can find roots that go back thousands of years. It's time to live as brothers. So why don't we listen to what was said, some highlights from what was said on the UN General Assembly floor with this emergency meeting about what is happening in Gaza.
We stress the need to fully respect international humanitarian law, which demands that Israel stop its indiscriminate and continued shelling of civilians and civilian property. Today, there isn't a single place or a single person in Gaza who is safe because of Israel's shelling of the refugee camps, of schools, of hospitals, of mosques, of churches, of United Nations facilities that people have sought refuge in. Moreover, many journalists and those working in healthcare have been killed. 70 UNRWA staff are among the dead. 70. And here we reiterate our strong condemnation of the violent Israeli shelling of the camp of Jabalia last Tuesday, which killed and wounded hundreds. Even those who have fled to the south. And despite Israel's impossible orders to evacuate the north, those were not safe from the shelling. As we have said repeatedly, the United Arab Emirates expresses its absolute rejection of the forced displacement of the Palestinian people from their land. We will not allow a new Palestinian Nakba. We are deeply concerned over Israel's announcement of a complete blockade on Gaza, as well as its cutting off of electricity and gas, which has led to the collapse of the health sector. And this comes after it has imposed strict controls over water and over food and other commodities. While humanitarian aid is accumulating at the Rafah crossing, only a very limited percentage of trucks have entered Gaza, representing less than 4% of the total volume of commodities that used to enter before the war. We appreciate Egypt's continued efforts to ensure access to humanitarian aid in Gaza, in addition to other critical efforts, including its receipt yesterday of a number of the injured and the ill from the war in Gaza for treatment. All parties to the conflict, namely Israel, must allow and facilitate rapid, safe, and unhindered passage of humanitarian aid for all civilians in need throughout Gaza in a sustainable manner. The full and unimpeded access of humanitarian personnel must also be ensured. We also stress the importance of allowing them into the Gaza Strip to address the acute humanitarian crisis there and to be able to travel throughout it. We further stress that internet and communication networks should resume and should continue to operate without interruption to facilitate the work of medical teams and humanitarian actors. Mr. President, the United Arab Emirates continues to follow its historic and long-standing approach of supporting the Palestinian people. Once the war began, we hastened to launch a national campaign entitled Tarahum, Compassion for Gaza, and we opened a humanitarian air bridge to Egypt for UAE aid and UN assistance to reach the people of Gaza as quickly as possible. The United Arab Emirates also pledged last month $20 million to the UNRWA. This comes in addition to the $35 million that we have already provided earlier this year. Moreover, the President of the United Arab Emirates, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, also directed the provision of medical treatment for 1,000 Palestinian children along with their families in the UAE. We continue to call for the international community to stop managing this conflict and to protect and achieve the two-state solution so that a sovereign Palestinian state is established on the borders of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Palestinian people have suffered for far too long under this occupation, and they, like other peoples, deserve a stable and secure future, a future in which the children of Gaza can attend schools and not shelter in them. A future where young men and women build the institutions of their state and not search for their relatives under the rubble. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zambia.
Mr. President, I thank you. I thank you for calling this emergency session of the General Assembly to discuss this very important subject matter. Zambia joins the rest of the international community in condemning the 7th October 2023 attack on Israel by Hamas, which now deteriorated into an ongoing conflict in the Gaza Strip. This dire situation has led to the grave loss of lives in both states, especially in Gaza, where thousands of innocent lives have been lost, including children. Zambia extends her heartfelt condolences and sympathies to all the families and communities affected by these events. Mr. President, Zambia respects the principle of protection of all civilians in situations of conflict. We therefore call for unhindered humanitarian support to all civilians affected by this conflict in order to ensure that the necessary aid flows in a timely manner to all needy areas in the Gaza Strip and in compliance with international humanitarian law. We also call for the immediate release of all hostages to ensure adherence and respect of international human rights law and in accordance with the principles of the United Nations Charter. Zambia therefore supports the efforts of the international community and African Union that have also called for the immediate cessation of hostilities. The government of the Republic of Zambia also recognizes that the acts of terrorism and killing of innocent civilians cannot continue to be committed in the pursuit of peace. Zambia joins the international community in condemning all acts of violence and continue to urge all parties to return to a space of dialogue. All efforts towards de-escalation of the war situation by all parties must be pursued. There is need to return to the negotiating table and implement the principle of the two-state solution, which this General Assembly agreed upon, where the two nations will live side by side in peace. Mr. President, if there was ever a time that the world has looked to the UN for a unified position in the pursuit of peace, the time is now. We therefore commend the UN Secretary General's effort in seeking peace in this conflict. It is hoped that in the spirit of searching peaceful avenues to resolve this conflict, the world will rally together, stand resolute against chaos, and seek a brighter and more harmonious path forward. In this regard, Zambia calls upon all member states to defend the true multilateralism and uphold the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. We should together support the United Nations system and its institutions and institutional leadership in discharging the mandate of the organization. Mr. President, in concluding, I'd like to restate that Zambia will continue to advocate for peaceful methods of conflict resolution. It is well known that without peace, the global community cannot attain sustainable development, and we cannot effectively pursue programs of economic and social development. We therefore reiterate our call for a more effective diplomatic dialogue and need for the UN and the member states to urgently come up with a workable, agreeable solution to resolve this conflict that the international community has been grappling with for so many years. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, the distinguished representative of Zambia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate, Mr. President, my country, Sudan, and the government of Sudan would like to associate itself with the statements delivered by the group of Arab states and Islamic states at the outset of this 10th emergency special session because it is the least or the minimum amount required to support the Palestinian people after the Security Council has failed in upholding its duties and responsibilities. Once again, the tragic situation in the Middle East and the Palestinian areas has the priority attention of the international community as a result of the resurgence of violence and destruction in an unprecedented and barbaric manner. The situation in the occupied Palestinian territories is the inevitable result of the international community's failure over decades to resolve the Palestinian issue on the basis of international law and the Arab Peace Initiative and other relevant United Nations resolutions in a manner that would achieve a just and comprehensive and lasting peace in the Middle East, which is the strategic option, the sole strategic option to achieve stability in the region. The continuation of this conflict without any clear political horizons for settlement will have dangerous repercussions and will prolong further wars in the region and the area at large, depriving the Palestinians from their legitimate and just right that has been guaranteed them by international laws and conventions for the establishment of an independent state that is sovereign and within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital is something that we reject. Moreover, the Security Council and the United Nations must shoulder their moral and legal responsibility and must work seriously towards achieving a two-state solution and the establishment of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. Any failure to protect civilians from the barbaric and systemic shelling is a failure by the international community and the United Nations. Therefore, the priority must be given to the protection of civilians and to alleviating the suffering. We should also give priority to protecting civilian infrastructure and property that is necessary for their daily life. Moreover, we must deliver urgent humanitarian care and reinstate water, power, food, and fuel. The behavior of the Israeli occupying authorities in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, including the siege imposed on it and the closure of crossing points to prevent aid arriving there, and its attempt to forcibly displace civilians while shelling them incessantly is a clear violation of international law and a cause of great concern. The government of Sudan reiterates that it stands by all the efforts that are being made to de-escalate and to stop the aggression on Gaza and the forced displacement of its people and the prolongation of a conflict that would only lead to more victims, more tragedy, and more humanitarian catastrophes in an area that is already riddled with crises. Therefore, our government stresses its support for the outcomes of the ministerial declaration issued by the League of Arab States in its regular session held on the 11th of October in Cairo on means of action to put an end to the Israeli aggression and to achieve peace and stability in the area, and to establish a fact-finding commission on the crimes perpetrated in Gaza and the West Bank that rise to the level of genocide and crime and wars of crime. Crimes of war. And Sudan also calls for lifting the siege that has been imposed on the Strip for more than 16 years and to offer humanitarian aid and medical aid so that we can avoid another Nakba that is soon to come. Sudan reiterates that the Palestinian question is the central and foremost question, and it reiterates its firm position calling for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the laws of the principles of international law and the Arab Peace Initiative and international terms of reference. We reiterate our position on the need to respect the historic identity, the Islamic and Christian identity of East Jerusalem and the status quo there, and make no attempt to change its demographic makeup. Voting in favor of this resolution, which was adopted by the General Assembly on Friday, and which was supported by the vast majority of member states, is a victory of humanity and justice. While we see that the numbers of victims has risen to over 9,000 victims in Gaza and the West Bank, and 23,000 have been injured. Supporting this resolution is the least we can do to save civilians from the machine of destruction and war that is targeting the Palestinian people, and that is especially targeting women, children, and the elderly. And it is what is needed to reinstate to revive work towards the two-state solution and to put an end to this evil that is reaping lives in a very terrible way. This resolution, adopted by the General Assembly, we hope that it will be used as the basis of a resolution for a ceasefire, for opening the border crossings, putting an end to the forced displacement, and for the delivery of aid, because what the Palestinian people are facing rises to the level of genocide and of crimes of war, and this has been described as such by legal experts. Therefore, we must push for putting an end to a vicious ground offensive that will only cause more victims and more deaths and would victimize more women, children, and elderly. These pictures are being broadcast by Arab international media and being resonated by demonstrations throughout the world. The viciousness of the Israeli attack and the huge numbers of victims and the huge numbers of those in need of aid make it important to immediately call for a humanitarian ceasefire so that we would avoid another humanitarian catastrophe that will be remembered in the books of contemporary history. The forced displacement of the people of Gaza to the desert or to the borders with Egypt is considered an act that threatens international and regional peace and security and must be stopped so that the current war would not expand. We join voices with those delegations that have commended the efforts of the Secretary General and his demands to open the Rafah crossing so that we would deliver humanitarian aid urgently, and preventing the Security Council from playing its part according to the Charter and preventing the Secretary General from performing his duties in dealing with conflicts will empty the United Nations of its content and of its purposes. Mr. President, the fact that the Security Council did not reach a just and comprehensive peace in the Middle East, and that it failed to shoulder its responsibilities and duties to maintain peace and security as a result of strict, narrow national considerations, is something that undermines the United Nations, which was established after a grinding war. And the Security Council must continue to achieve peace and security and a resolution to conflicts, or else we will threaten future generations with a life in a world where war is rampant and where nowhere is safe from bloodshed and destruction. And this is a failure of humanity as a whole. We must work together so that we do not push the United Nations to the fate of the League of Nations, which was killed by its inability to take its own decisions. Moreover, giving precedence to narrow national interests over the interest of global and world peace means that we need to make positive approaches to resolve problems and conflicts and to arrive at settlements and constructive concessions. And one of the most important features of multilateral diplomacy is to adopt a win-win approach by all parties. However, the current approach has been frozen in a lose-lose approach, in a zero-sum approach that will only lead to more paralysis and which will only hinder the Security Council from performing its charter-mandated duties. If we were to make progress, then we must stick to consensus and to agreement so that we would serve the goal of peace. Therefore, we call upon the international community to adopt multilateralism and to put forth the common interest of humanity in order to work towards peace and to work towards ending war. The United Nations is the mechanism to establish its values and its criteria so that we would work towards multilateralism and towards peace, and security in the world. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sudan. Next speaker is distinguished representative of Nauru.
Mr. President, Nauru welcomes the convening of the 10th Emergency Special Session. However, we are disappointed that the UN Security Council was not able to perform its mandate to maintaining and ensuring international peace and security. Nevertheless, as members of the United Nations and upholders of the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and the rule of law, it is our duty to meet and discuss this very important issue. Mr. President, Nauru condemns the horrendous terror attacks on October 7th to the Israeli people by Hamas, a genocidal terror organization who are responsible for the loss of innocent lives and taking innocent civilians as hostages. We join the call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Moreover, we also call on member states to intensify efforts to suppress financing of terrorism. We support Israel's right to defend itself and its citizens in accordance with international law. We acknowledge the efforts by the UN Secretary General and some members in trying to resolve and de-escalate the situation. It is important more than ever that we all work together to redouble our diplomatic efforts so that the situation in the Middle East does not spill over across the region. We also encourage and welcome all efforts to facilitate humanitarian corridors and other initiatives for safe passage and delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians. It is critical that we provide essential goods and services, including water, food, medical supplies, and humanitarian aid. Mr. President, I take this moment to express our sincere condolences to the families for the loss of innocent lives in Israel and Gaza, and to those brave humanitarian staff of the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees who lost their lives in their line of duty. Nauru supports the two-state solution where the people of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank you, the distinguished representative of Nauru. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brunei Darussalam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Mr. President, for resuming this 10th emergency special session during this necessary and urgent time. Brunei Darussalam is grateful to the delegations that promptly submitted the request to convene this ESS at the earliest possible opportunity. At the outset, we align ourselves with the statement delivered by Mauritania on behalf of the OIC. In particular, Brunei Darussalam strongly condemns the recent severe escalation of violence that has resulted in the unjustifiable loss of innocent lives, suffering, and destruction of property in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. We are deeply saddened by the intensifying number of civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip, including the elderly, women, and babies that is only increasing day by day. Mr. President, this current escalation is a direct result of the injustice and suffering that has been imposed by the occupying power for over the past 75 years. And after all these decades of being on the international agenda, there needs to be a full understanding and recognition of the Palestinian struggle. As Brunei Darussalam has mentioned over the past many years, including during our general debate statements, Palestine has been under daily siege, violence, and occupation, suffering from the apartheid policies of the occupying power to illegal activity and violence from settlers. Palestinians suffer daily violations to their basic human rights and dignities, from restrictions to food, water, electricity, shelter, and medicine, and even so far as to restrict them from their right to worship by not allowing access to the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque, to the bombing of their places of worship. Mr. President, violence and breaches of international law in the occupied Palestinian territories are increasing with impunity. Urgent action is needed. We urge all parties to immediately cease all forms of violence and exercise utmost restraint. Brunei Darussalam will continue to fully support all efforts and mediation initiatives to de-escalate the situation immediately and to ensure the situation in Palestine remains the top priority in the international agenda, especially here at the UN. We call upon all parties to abide by their obligations in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law and the UN Charter, including especially in ensuring the safety and security of all civilians as well as civilian infrastructure in this conflict. The level of violence and indiscriminate attacks in both Gaza and the West Bank has been not only disproportionate and excessive, but also targets innocent civilians and continues unabated. From the inhumane blockade in Gaza to the intentional deprivation of food, water, and electricity, and the targeting of civilian infrastructure and evacuation routes. We have seen Palestinians forced out of their homes and the escalation of settler violence. And of particular concern is the forced displacement of Palestinians from the north to the south of Gaza. We cannot allow such acts to continue and merely stand by and watch the forcible displacement of a group of people from their homes, reminiscent of the first Nakba 75 years ago. We need to ensure that displaced Palestinians are assured of their right to return to their homes and properties. The escalation of violence within a crippling occupation has exacerbated an already dire humanitarian crisis. While we welcome news that humanitarian aid has begun to enter Gaza through the reopening of the Rafah border, it has been in limited quantities, insufficient for a population already struggling under occupation and facing the looming advent of winter. We call for the establishment of humanitarian corridors to the occupied Palestinian territory for full and sustained access to relief, aid, and assistance. In this regard, we would like to commend the various humanitarian agencies under the UN, the Red Crescent societies, and other organizations in facilitating the delivery of food, water, medicine, and other much-needed emergency supplies, as well as contributions from member states. As part of our national efforts to contribute to such relief assistance, we have established the Humanitarian Fund for Palestinians in Gaza 2023. We hope these various international and different national efforts can safely and steadfastly continue with no impediments so much needed aid can be provided and reach everyone in need. In particular, we would also like to acknowledge the work and sacrifice of UNRWA personnel, our deepest gratitude for their unwavering dedication to alleviating suffering in the most challenging circumstances, and our heartfelt condolences to the loved ones of those that have lost their lives in the pursuit of doing so. Mr. President, the work of the UN, from the Secretary General to humanitarian personnel, are absolutely indispensable in this time of conflict. Brunei Darussalam strongly supports their efforts, and we believe that those carrying out such work and activities should never be targeted. The escalation of conflict and violence in Palestine did not occur in a vacuum. To this end, we reaffirm our support also towards international efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East on the basis of international law and the relevant UN resolutions. In this regard, we fully supported the adoption of the resolution introduced by Jordan titled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations, that we have co-sponsored and welcome its adoption with the support of an overwhelming majority of member states. This is a clear and resounding indication that the international community recognizes the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and that urgent and immediate action is needed to prevent further destabilization and escalation of violence in the region. Mr. President, the Security Council has a special and moral responsibility to faithfully fulfill its obligations to uphold international peace and security. And we, as members of this August Assembly, must ensure that we don't fail the people of Palestine yet, once again. Brunei Darussalam continues to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and we remain resolute in our commitment to supporting Palestine in pursuit of its inalienable rights to self-determination. We reaffirm also our commitment to this two-state solution with an independent and sovereign state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brunei Darussalam. Next speaker is distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, 20 months ago, a full-fledged war against Ukraine waged by Russia has showed how fragile our world is if the insane dictator equipped with the weapons of mass destruction decides to employ terrorist practices against peaceful sovereign state. The fact that the Assembly had to resume 10th emergency special session is another warning sign that instead of resolving existing conflicts, we are dealing with their multiplication. The terrorist groups and terrorist regimes are the only beneficiaries of these menacing developments. Mr. President, we condemn the brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks of Hamas on Israel on October 7th that plunged the Middle East region into hostilities. The barbaric massacre by Hamas led to horrendous toll of casualties in the course of ongoing hostilities, including among the citizens of Ukraine as well as many other countries. I would like to reiterate once again that Ukrainians feel deeply the pain and devastation of war. Russia and Hamas are driven by the same motivation. As Hamas denies the right of Israel to exist, Russia denies the same right of Ukraine and continues its terror and war of aggression against Ukraine and Ukrainians as a nation. We are concerned that Hamas continues to terrorize the region by indiscriminate attacks against civilians, as well as uses them as a human shield. They are still keeping over 200 hostages in Gaza, including babies, children, women, and the elderly. It's also clear that all these actions only aggravate the situation in the region. There is a real threat that conflict could spread throughout the entire region. We must increase our common efforts to avoid further escalation. We are convinced that the strong condemnation of Hamas should be an essential part of the General Assembly response to the current situation. Ukraine has always advocated for calling a spade a spade. We regret that the proposed amendment to the draft resolution regarding the condemnation of Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel has not been approved. We also firmly support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We demand immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Today, it is critically important to avoid further increase in the number of civilian casualties, both in Israel and Palestine. Every life is a value. All civilians must be protected. The international community must take all possible measures to safeguard the innocent civilian lives, including the international and local humanitarian personnel that work on the ground. We urge to strictly abide by the rules of warfare and respect the norms of international humanitarian law. All action must be taken to save lives and minimize harm to civilians. Ukraine expresses gravest concern for the deterioration of humanitarian situation in Gaza. We emphasize the need of unhindered humanitarian access and aid to protect and help civilians, including through humanitarian corridors. Ukraine is convinced that humanitarian support and access must be maintained into Gaza to enable access to essential aid, water, food, and medical care, fuel, and shelter to reach all civilians that are suffering. We commend dedicated humanitarian work of the UNRWA staff and all agencies who provide humanitarian support. We express our sincere condolences to families of the humanitarian personnel who have lost their lives since October 7. Mr. President, current situation in the region only undermines the prospects of a peaceful future for two peoples. At the same time, the Middle East peace process remains the basis of any efforts aimed at restoring regional stability and security. Ukraine has consistently supported the implementation of the principle of two states, Israel and Palestine, that live side by side in peace and security, and advocates the settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with the help of political and diplomatic means. We are confident that a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace in the Middle East can be realized within the framework of unconditional implementation of relevant UN Security Council resolutions and other international agreements. The General Assembly has demanded to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian objects, as well to enable and facilitate humanitarian access for essential supplies and services to reach all civilians in need. The immediate, continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provisions of essential goods and services to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip. The Assembly also called for immediate, full, sustained, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access for the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and all other humanitarian organizations upholding humanitarian principles and delivering urgent assistance to civilians in the Gaza Strip. Encouraged the establishment of humanitarian corridors and other initiatives to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians, and welcomes efforts in this regard. Ukraine calls for these urgent tasks to be fully implemented. I thank you.
I thank you, distinguished representative of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this emergency special session of the General Assembly as the ongoing hostilities in the Middle East necessitate urgent attention. My delegation begins by recalling the UN Security Council Resolution 242, which enshrines the international community's commitment to seeking a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine to peacefully exist alongside each other within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. This resolution, from which there must be no derogation, constitutes the cornerstone of diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. In this vein, Mr. President, we unequivocally condemn the abhorrent attacks carried out by Hamas and the Israeli Defense Force in Israel and Gaza, which run counter to our ambitions. The illegal colonization and occupation of Palestinian territory and the gradual erosion of its internationally established borders continue to be the root cause of violence. If this remains unaddressed and unresolved, hostilities will continue unabated, haunting us and future generations. We underscore that the right of Israel to exist in peace is not tantamount to an unfettered license for the illegal occupation and suppression of the rights of the Palestinian people, which are egregious affronts to international law. Mr. President, the Security Council's ability to effectively transform the situation on the ground is being questioned by the international community, which more and more is becoming understandably frustrated with the Council's paralysis. This inaction is the reason why we are gathered here today. The will of the Palestinian people and an overwhelming majority of the General Assembly have been thwarted by a minority of powerful states. We urge the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility and rise to the occasion. We appeal to the veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council, more specifically the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, who have regularly supported Israel's policies to engage constructively to facilitate a cessation of hostilities, support the urgent and unhindered passage of humanitarian aid, and insist on the equal application of international law. We underscore that while Article 51 preserves the inherent right to self-defense, this mechanism cannot be allowed to be used as a justification for the indiscriminate killing of civilians or to shield violations of international law. To remain within the parameters of what is legally acceptable and appropriate self-defense must be both necessary and proportionate. Mr. President, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, estimates that over 640,000 people have been internally displaced and are sheltering in UNRWA's facilities. Over 9,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip since October 7th, with children making up more than 3,000 of the aggregate and over 20,000 injured. Behind each of these numbers is a face, no less worthy of a right to life than you or me. These statistics unambiguously illustrate that the justification of self-defense has gone beyond what is proportionate and necessary, and therefore exceeded the realm of what is legally acceptable. In other words, how many human beings must die before the Security Council considers the act of exercising the veto more egregious than its moral and legal obligation of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war? The ambitions enshrined in the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 necessitate action to enable their realization. In this context, St. Vincent and the Grenadines co-sponsored the resolution that was tabled by the Arab group and adopted by the General Assembly last week. We believe that the draft resolution contains fundamental elements that demonstrate the international community's commitment to upholding international law, as well as to facilitating the action necessary to safeguard the rights of civilians. An immediate ceasefire is non-negotiable. The people of Palestine deserve to exist in peace in the same way that the people of Israel deserve that peace. St. Vincent and the Grenadines reaffirms its support for the Secretary General's leadership and sustained engagement on the Palestine question, and we express our appreciation to the UN agencies that are undertaking efforts to bring immediate relief to those most in need. We urge all stakeholders, particularly those with influence, to work constructively towards facilitating an immediate end to the hostilities that would enable the creation of an environment conducive to achieving a just and lasting peace in line with UN Security Council Resolution 242. Thank you, Mr. President, colleagues. Peace profound.
Thank you for listening today. You've been listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. Our general goal as a show is to help spread the news commentary with the idea of spreading love around the planet, to try to bring that love, that trust, that faith, so that people can live equally and live without violence and fighting. Hit that subscribe button if you agree with us and that we need to find a way to end the violence and end the fighting, and bring those conflicts to an end, and bring everybody to a negotiating table where we can figure out the differences and live in harmony. Hit that subscribe button now, please. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.